Have you ever felt like the price you pay for things is, well, just kind of made up? Or maybe wondered if all those government rules are actually making your life easier or harder? Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain and uncover the hidden economic forces that set the price of everything. From your morning coffee to your monthly rent. By the end of this, you'll see how one simple idea can reveal who really wins and who loses when the rules of the game get changed.
So let's start with a big one, a pretty controversial question that affects millions of us. Should the government step in and control apartment rents? On the surface, it seems like a no-brainer, right? A great way to make housing more affordable. But, as we're about to find out, the economic reality, well, it has some very surprising twists.
But before we can even begin to tackle that rent control question, we need a way to measure what's going on. Think of it like this. We need an economic happiness meter, a tool that lets us see the total benefit a market creates for every single person involved.
And that meter? It all starts with the feeling we have all had. You know that feeling of getting a fantastic deal? That moment you realize you were totally willing to pay more for something, but you didn't have to. Well, economists have a name for that awesome feeling of extra value, or cash left in your pocket. It's called consumer surplus.
Okay, let's use a simple market for chai tea to see how this works. Meet Teresa. She absolutely loves her chai, and honestly, she'd happily pay $6 for a cup. But look at that, the market price is only $3.50. That $2.50 difference, that right there, that's her personal consumer surplus. It's real value she gets to keep.
But of course, Teresa isn't the only one buying chai. You've got Tom, who is willing to pay $5, and Terry, who is willing to pay $4. Since the price is $3.50 for everyone, they both buy a cup and get their own little piece of that surplus pie. So the total consumer surplus for the entire market is just all of these individual benefits added up together.
And here's where this idea gets really powerful. In a real market, with thousands or even millions of buyers, we don't have to add up every single person's surplus one by one. The total consumer surplus actually becomes this entire shaded area on the graph. It's everything below that demand curve, but above the actual market price.
So let's just nail this down. Think of consumer surplus as the measure of the good deal that everyone in the market is getting, all added together. It's the gap between what something is truly worth to us and what we actually have to hand over to get it. It's a really powerful way to measure the well-being of consumers in pretty much any market.
And believe me, this isn't just some abstract theory from a textbook. Economists actually estimated that back in 2006, the consumer surplus for broadband internet was nearly $900 million every single month. That is a staggering amount of hidden value that consumers were getting, all from just being online. Okay, so we can now measure the benefit to consumers. That's a huge step, but that's really only half the picture. To judge any kind of policy, we need a baseline, right? We need to know what a perfectly balanced market even looks like. What is the ideal that we're supposed to be aiming for? And this right here illustrates it beautifully. The sweet spot is at equilibrium, that point where the supply curve and the demand curve cross. At this exact point, the total economic pie, which is made up of the consumer surplus we just talked about, plus the producer surplus, which is the benefit to sellers, is as big as it can possibly get. This ideal state is what economists call economic efficiency. And really, it's just a fancy way of saying that every single transaction that should happen is happening. The value to a buyer is perfectly matched with the cost to a seller. No value is being left on the table. This is our gold standard. This is what we'll use to judge our policies.
All right, we've got our tools. We know how to measure value with consumer surplus, and we know what an ideal, efficient market looks like. So now we can finally run our experiment. Let's apply these tools to our original question about rent control.
Just take a look here. On the left, you've got a normal, balanced apartment market. Everything's in equilibrium. But on the right, the government steps in and imposes a rent ceiling, a maximum price. And look what happens instantly. At that lower price, landlords have way less incentive to rent out apartments, so they supply fewer of them. At the same time, way more people want one. And just like that, you've created a shortage.
But a shortage is really just the most obvious outcome. The really interesting question, the hidden one, is about that economic pie we were talking about. What happened to the total value in this market? Where did it go? This slide breaks it down perfectly. That blue rectangle, Area A, that shows what the policy is trying to do. It shifts value, or surplus, away from landlords and gives it to the lucky few renters who actually get a cheap apartment. But now, look at that yellow triangle, Areas B and C. Because fewer apartments are available, All those potential rentals that both a landlord and a renter would have been happy to agree on, now they just can't happen. That value isn't transferred to anyone. It just vanishes into thin air.
And that vanished value? It has a specific name: deadweight loss. It's the measure of pure inefficiency. A great way to think of it is as the chunk of the economic pie that gets thrown right in the trash, simply because the market was stopped from working the way it's supposed to. It's a loss that benefits absolutely no one.
So let's just sum this all up. Who wins and who loses here? Well, the lucky renters who manage to snag a rent-controlled apartment, they're definitely better off. But the landlords are worse off. The unlucky renters who now can't find an apartment at all, they're worse off. And most importantly, society as a whole is worse off because that total economic pie has shrunk.
You know, this result isn't unique to rent control either. Price controls, even when they're well-intentioned, have very predictable outcomes. Price ceilings, when they're set below the market price, they almost always create shortages. And on the flip side, price floors, like a minimum wage set above the market rate, they can create surpluses. In both cases, the total economic pie shrinks, and you often see black markets pop up to get around the rules.
This quote really captures the fundamental trade-off that's at the heart of price controls. The goal might be to help a specific group, and yeah, in some ways it does. But the unavoidable side effect is often an overall loss of value and efficiency for the economy as a whole.
Okay, so we've seen that price controls have these hidden costs. But what about another really common form of government intervention? Taxes. When the government puts a tax on something like gasoline or cigarettes, who do you think actually ends up footing the bill? The answer might not be who the law says it is.
Let's take a look at this market for cigarettes. The government comes in and imposes a $1 tax per pack. But notice the result. The price buyers actually pay goes up by 90 cents, while the amount sellers get to keep in their pocket goes down by 10 cents. The government gets its dollar, sure, but the burden is split very unevenly. 90% of it falls on the buyer, and only 10% falls on the seller.
So who ends up paying more? It always comes down to a really simple rule. The burden of a tax falls most heavily on the side of the market that is less flexible, the side that can easily just walk away from the deal. So if buyers absolutely need the product, guess what? They're going to pay most of the tax. If sellers have no other options for what to do with their product, they're the ones who will end up absorbing most of the cost. Now for a fascinating real-world example, the Social Security tax, you see it on your paycheck, is by law split right down the middle, 50-50, between you and your employer. But based on what we just learned, do you think the economic burden is really split 50-50?
The economic consensus on this is a pretty resounding no. Most economists agree that workers, employees, bear the vast majority of the tax burden. And why is that? Well, it's because companies are generally more responsive to changes in labor costs than individual workers are to small changes in their wages. I mean, most of us don't quit our job over a tiny pay cut, right? And this really reveals the crucial takeaway of our entire exploration. A policy's intention and its true economic consequence can be two completely different things. It forces us to ask, what other hidden costs are we paying every single day?